So let's go ahead and jump into our topics for tonight. We will be discussing integrating SEL in online language classrooms. And we will have Dr. Anne-Marie Gunter with us. She is the World Languages Consultant for the Division of Academic Standards at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. And also working with her to discuss promotion for self-awareness with students is Zatli Stock. She is the ESL Title III Consultant for the EL Program Quality in the East Division. She's with the Department of Academic Standards for the North Carolina Department of Instruction. So Zatli and Anne-Marie, I do want to officially welcome you. We are very happy to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you as well. We're happy to be here and share with you about SEL, as well as some of the work we've been doing in North Carolina with social and emotional learning. I'm going to go ahead and show my screen so we can get started. All right, so I hope everyone can see my screen. We have broken our presentation into two parts tonight, and I get to lead the first part about integrating SEL in online language classrooms. And then Sally will be here with part two with promoting self-awareness with students. You've already had our welcome and introductions, but I do want you to take note of our Twitter handles. Sally may even be asking you to do an activity with our Twitter handles, and of course you can always contact us that way. Our agenda is pretty simple and straightforward tonight. We're going to begin with some welcome and introductions, give you an overview of the 5 SEL competencies, sort of a SEL 101 to get us started. Then we're going to talk about integrating our 5 SEL competencies into online language classrooms, and then continue on about developing self-awareness skills in particular in the language classroom. To begin, we wanted to share with you not only the 5 SEL competencies and give you an overview, but in fact, help you understand too all of the things that surround implementing SEL and social emotional learning into your lives as well as your classrooms. One of the things that we rely on quite a bit is what's called the SEL 3 Signature Practices Playbook. This is a tool, a resource for all of us that's put together by the national group that works on SEL. And so in the 3 signature practices, there are always 3 things you do in a presentation or in your classroom to make sure that you're implementing SEL. The first is a welcoming and inclusion activity. As you might guess, the purpose of that is to build community and connect to the work ahead. Sometimes we call it an educational warm-up or an icebreaker. And as you can see on the screen, we've taken some screenshots of the 3 signature practices playbook to show you what that looks like, and the fact that they have examples for each of these signature practices for adult learners as well as younger learners in classrooms. So our welcoming and inclusion activity tonight to create our sense of community is to ask you, where and when in the world are you joining us from? We want you to type your country and your local time in the chat so that we can see where you're at around the world, and what time it is for you during today. Are you later in the evening? Maybe you've already had dinner. Are you more towards the afternoon sometime, where you just had lunch or something else? All right, great. I see a lot of folks who are in the US someplace, in one of our time zones. Whole variety of Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific time zones, as well as Hawaii. Didn't see anybody from Alaska yet. I see a couple of other countries though. We've got Japan represented, Palestine at 2 in the morning, by the way. So our colleagues from around the globe are joining us at very different times during their day. So welcome everyone. I'm glad we're all here together to learn. So let's begin with an overview of the 5 SEL competencies. You're going to see this graphic here on the screen quite a bit tonight, and I'm sure you'll become familiar with it over the course of this series. Notice that there are 5 SEL competencies that are there in the middle. They're the ones that are in orange, yellow, and green: self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. But surrounding that is all of the things that are supporting students and supporting every individual who's learning in the community. And that starts with our classrooms, where we think about instruction with SEL implemented effectively, and our classroom climate and how that can impact our students. After that, one step out is in our schools. What is our school-wide culture? What practices and policies do we have in place that support social and emotional learning? Going a little bit further out, we go to our families and our caregivers, all the people that make up our community, but are directly linked to our students. And so we want to make sure we have authentic partnerships with those groups and those individuals. And finally, our community as a whole, a much larger kind of concept for us, but the community as a whole is supporting all of those aligned learning opportunities that SEL helps enhance. So what is SEL? That's one of the first questions people ask. We want to emphasize to you that SEL is not just one thing, but it's a process. It's something we think about and think about how it's integrated into our lives in general. And we also want to emphasize that SEL and social emotional learning concepts are just as important for adults as they are for children and the learners that we're teaching in our classrooms. So that's something to keep in mind when you even think about your own growth, professional growth, personal growth, as well as your colleagues and, of course, your students. So SEL is basically looking at how we develop healthy identities. Who are we in our different roles in different settings? So who someone is at school is different than at home because they have different roles and tasks. We also look at SEL being a place where we understand and manage emotions. We have to know how to handle what happens to us and how we react to that. Also part of SEL is setting and achieving positive goals. How do we move forward? How do we plan to take the steps necessary to move forward in whatever aspect of our life we're thinking about? Also, how do we feel and show empathy to another person or to our group as we're learning together? Obviously, we also want to establish and maintain positive relationships with everyone that we work with. So whether students are partnering in class with someone, working in a small group, or you're thinking about taking that out into the larger groups of communities, we need to think about how we build those positive relationships. And finally, we want to make good, caring, and responsible decisions. And decision making is a critical component of SEL, especially when we think about decisions we make for ourselves and how they impact others, as well as the decisions we make as a whole, as a group, and what that leads to for us. So that's the overview of what is SEL. Remember, it's a process. And then we get to, of course, what are the benefits of SEL? Why do SEL at all? And for us in language education, I will tell you that you're going to find out very quickly, we are already working a lot with SEL concepts and with the process by which we develop skills in SELs and competencies. But in general, when we look at the research, we know that students have better academic performance when SEL is part of their learning and part of their instruction. We know that their attitudes and behaviors are improved overall. So when we think about things like classroom management and that kind of thing, that is positively impacted by SEL. We have fewer negative behaviors from students, as well as reduced emotional stress. And I think all of us can probably agree the stress and some of the things that have happened over these past couple of years have certainly given us a new perspective on how we help our students deal with that stress and integrate a calm approach into their lives so that they have good attitudes and behaviors and their academic performance continues to improve. You'll notice there's a quote on the right-hand side of the screen that is pretty significant, I think, to us here in language education. But it talks about, what a child can do, advance math, speak 3 languages, we hope, right? Or receive top grades. But if they can't manage their emotions, do some conflict resolution or handle stress, none of that academic achievement or those skills that they've developed that they could take into post-secondary education or careers and jobs is going to matter, because they need skills so that they can get along with others and also manage themselves. There is a link on this slide that you'll get later if you want to find out more about that research related to SEL. All right, so let's get into it. Now that we know a little bit about SEL, and we know a little bit about each other and where we are and when we are in the world, let's move on to our second signature practice with SEL and start to look carefully at these SEL competencies that we're going to talk about tonight. The second signature practice for SEL is engaging pedagogy and practices. And so when you do that, and we all do that as teachers, right? You have to think about, how am I going to get my students to anchor their thinking and learning and really focus with the kinds of interactive activities that we do, as well as the reflective experiences that we ask them to do as part of their learning. And so that's what an engaging pedagogy and practices signature practice is all about. Again, in that SEL 3 Signature Practices playbook, there are examples of those, both for adults and for younger learners, like in classrooms. I imagine, again, a lot of these are familiar to you as you look over them, doing things like think time, or turn to your partner, or think, pair, share, as well as brain breaks and opportunities for interaction. So the first one I want to do with you tonight is called Waterfalls in the Chat. Some of you have probably done this. This is an activity that we're going to do, so I don't want to be just having a sit and get tonight. I want us to do some activities. So for the Waterfalls in the Chat, what that is an activity whereby you do some thinking and then sharing with what you do. So notice on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the 5 SEL competencies that were mentioned before: the self-awareness, the self-management, the responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. They've all got a letter that goes with them. That's always important to us in education. So what I want you to do as we go through this, each one, is we're going to give you a think time of 30 seconds. During that time, you'll read the definition of a particular SEL competency on the screen. You'll choose 1 to 5 words, because we're language people. We'll choose 1 to 5 words in that definition that help you understand which of the 5 SEL competencies it describes. And then we'll match that SEL competency with its language, or the language you chose, that describe it. So you'll type the letter of the SEL competency that you think it is with the 1 to 5 words you've chosen in the chat. However, and this is the important part about Waterfalls in the chat, you'll have to wait until you hear the word go to click enter in the chat. So you'll put your answer together with your letter that you think it is and the words that you've picked out that describe it. And then once I say go, we'll watch the waterfall of responses for each SEL competency. So we'll be able to see the answers together. It's important that you wait until you hear go. I know that's hard sometimes with teachers. So let's go ahead and give it a shot. Match the SEL competency with its language. So on the right-hand side is the screen is the definition, and I want you to match that with A, B, C, D, or E, and then the words in that definition that you think lead you to that SEL competency. Go ahead, take your think time. Ten seconds, go ahead and start typing your answer. All right, go. Please put them in the chat what you decided this SEL competency was. See a lot of correct answers. It is B, self-management. And that's the ability to successfully regulate your emotions, your thoughts, your behaviors in different situations. Take a look in the chat at what people are saying are the words that drew them to that particular self-competency, or SEL competency. Definitely controlling impulses, motivating yourself. Very good. All right, that's our first waterfall. Here's our next one. Again, read what's on the right-hand side of the screen and go ahead and start typing your answer, but don't hit enter yet. Ten seconds. Go. All right, I've got a little variation this time. It is C, responsible decision making. And you see on the screen highlighted or in bold the words we thought you would pick. And a lot of people pick these: making constructive choices, making sure that you're looking at ethical standards, safety concerns, social norms, all of that. Making choices. All right. All right, next one up. Please go ahead and read on the right-hand side of the screen and make your decisions. All right, 10 seconds. All right, go. All right. See a lot of correct answers. This is E, social awareness. And people are picking out the fact that for social awareness, you have to empathize with others. You have to take their perspectives. You have to think about social and ethical norms, and be ready to consider what resources are available to you in different groups with that. All right. Next one up, go ahead and read and put your answer in. Take about 10 more seconds. All right, go. All right, you are correct. This is D, relationship skills, that ability to establish and maintain healthy and rewarding relationships and all that that involves, communicating clearly, listening well, cooperating with others. Very good. All right. Now the last one, obviously you probably figured out what the answer is, but do go ahead and take some time, still read the definition and pick out the words, 1 to 5 words that mean the most to you for how this is defined. All right, 10 more seconds. Go. Yes, of course, we know this last one would have to be self-awareness, but it's that ability to accurately recognize your own emotions, thoughts, and values and how they influence behavior. You need to assess your strengths and limitations. And I see a lot of people focusing in on that. Great. Well, thank you so much for participating in Waterfalls in the chat. I hope you've gotten an overview quickly here of the 5 SEL competencies. And you're ready to move on then to talk about how we integrate those 5 SEL competencies into online language classrooms. So that's the next part of our session here. When we think about the SEL competencies in language standards, like I mentioned before, we kind of have an advantage over some of our colleagues, maybe in other content areas or subject areas, because we know that language standards and the local curriculum written for them, whether you're looking at state language standards and writing your local curriculum for that, or you're looking at national language standards of some kind and putting together curriculum or materials for that, we know that first and foremost, when we talk about language education, we're going to talk about communication. And you saw in the definitions of the 5 competencies how important communication was. We also have in language standards respect for others, particularly when we think about working with other cultures and communities. We also have the concepts of empathy and decision-making and teamwork, as well as cooperation in what we do in the classroom and how we use our language skills once we leave the classroom. So you see on the screen our World Readiness Standards for Learning Languages. That's our national standards, if you will, or what's affectionately called the 5 C's, because it works on communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, and communities. And again, you see that reflected a lot in the things that SEL already focuses on. For most of us who are in the US, I know some of you who are in other countries, this may be a little bit different. You may be using national standards throughout, but in the US, we typically have state standards that are written and aligned to our national standards, but are implemented a little bit differently depending on our context. So for example, in North Carolina, I'm going to give you a visual of our state standards for language education. That one on the right-hand side of the screen that looks like a weave, and in fact, we call it the weave graphic, shows how our 4 standards and what we call our 3 strands weave together or come together to make our state standards. And so you see the same kinds of things from the national standards, and you see that alignment to our national standards because we have communication as our first 3 standards, interpersonal communication, interpretive communication, and presentational communication. So that's the 1C out of the 5. Then we have culture as our second C or 4th standard. And then we have the connections, comparisons, and communities woven as strands through all of that. So that's how our state standards look in North Carolina for world languages. Similarly, our ESL colleagues focus on language and start with communication and look at language of all kinds of things. So as you can see on that graphic there towards the bottom of the screen, the WIDA standards, which are used not only in North Carolina for ESL state standards, but in a number of states. They are a consortium across the country. They focus first on language for social and instructional purposes. So there we've got SEL form in the front right there. And then the other standards, of course, look at the language of the different subject areas that English learners are focused on. And so we still get that idea of communication throughout with language standards, but in slightly different ways, again, depending on the context. So that's how our SEL competencies are already in our language standards, no matter where we are in the world. In North Carolina, a couple of years ago, we actually embarked on a project to create North Carolina's SEL standards mapping documents. And this is where we looked at the SEL competencies and how they would work in our different types of classrooms with teaching different subjects. And we created a document to show how our state standards were already mapped and integrated SEL into what we did in the classroom. So what we did was we created a document for each of our content areas that had an overview of the 5 SEL competencies, but it would be from the perspective of that kind of learning. So for us, we have an overview of the 5 SEL competencies from the perspective of language learning in both ESL, English as a second language, and world languages. So I'm putting up shots on the screen for you to see there. Statly is going to add links to those documents if you'd like to take a look at them. Thanks, Statly. I see those coming up right now. And we also included the link to all of our North Carolina SEL standards mapping documents. So if you want to see the one for math or science or social studies, you could certainly go to our documents table and see that. But we also gave you a direct link to our NCDPI SEL World Languages document and ESL document. Within those documents, those standards mapping documents, there are examples of lessons, activities, and teaching practices that support SEL, and they're organized in a particular way. First of all, they're organized by each SEL competency. So as you can imagine, and this is just a screenshot of one, they have 5 different sections because there are 5 SEL competencies. For the world languages ones, they're also organized by proficiency levels because we have proficiency-based standards in North Carolina using the ACTFL scale, the national proficiency scale. And so here I have a little example of that on the screen too. So if you're teaching world languages, know that that's also in there to kind of guide what's happening at each level of proficiency with language and how different activities and lessons and teaching practices might apply to, let's say, beginners of language versus more advanced students. So we share these documents with you not only to give you a resource, but to help us have a deeper discussion of implementing SEL in language classrooms, and specifically online language classrooms. So this brings us to our second activity, or engaging practice in pedagogy, which is flood the chat. Now you're probably thinking, isn't that similar to Waterfalls in the chat? And it is. There are 2 notable exceptions though. We had multiple waterfalls, and here we're only going to have 1 flood. And also, sometimes, culturally speaking, you have to be careful what you call your engaging practices or activities. As teachers, of course, we have plenty of practice coming up with a name for what we're going to do in the classroom or what kind of activity the students are expected to do, and we want them to get used to that. In North Carolina, we have to be careful. When we talk about waterfalls, there are many waterfalls in the western part of the state. They're very beautiful to visit up in the mountains. But we've had some floods too related to our hurricanes. So when we talk about floods, we have to be careful. Notice the picture I chose was of sort of after the flood when things are recovering. But with the flood the chat, we're going to look again at these 5 SEL competencies. And I kept the same A, B, C, D, E order that we had before. And we're going to look at some examples from those NC SEL mapping documents and consider what we can learn from those and what you can apply in your own classrooms. So what I want you to do is choose a SEL competency, just one of the 5. As we discuss the lessons, activities, and teaching practices from our SEL standards mapping documents, think about how you could use that in your classroom. It may be something that you have used in the past and maybe just haven't done it recently, or you may see something that makes you think you've got a new thing that you could try, a new practice or activity or something you could do, or maybe you can sort of recycle and adapt something you've done before with something that we talk about here or that you think about tonight in relation to SEL competency. As you're thinking about that, considering which SEL competency you want to focus on, we're going to ask you to describe how you'll use or adapt the lesson, the activity, or the teaching practice that we're sharing with you. Now, obviously, if you linked to one of our documents, you can take a look at additional, practices and lessons and activities if you want. But we're going to focus on a few in the next few slides. Then what we'll have you do is type the letter of the SEL competency you chose in the chat. Add your description as we go, so you can be working on that as we talk about things. You've probably already noticed there's some overlap between our SEL competencies. So even if you're following one, let's say self-awareness, but you see something else later on that maybe has to do with self-management or your social awareness, you may want to combine them a little bit, and that's great. And then once again, wait until you hear go to click enter in the chat at the end, and then we'll watch the flood of responses, but we'll only have one flood at the end. All right, let's go ahead and take a look. Pick your SEL competency that you'd like to focus on. We're going to start with A, self-awareness in the online language classroom. Now, in our NC-SEL standards mapping documents, one of the things we do is that we talk about what the competency means, just like we did in that first activity. Here's how the competency is defined, and you look at the language and so forth. But we also kind of revised and shared in those documents a definition of that competency that makes sense for the content you're teaching. In our case, makes sense for teaching a language. And so self-awareness now also looks at learning a new or target language and developing intercultural competence, because we, of course, are always teaching about other cultures. And as part of learning about another culture, when you learn a language, you also begin to learn more about your own as you reflect on your practices. So when you're doing that and looking at intercultural competence, you become aware of yourself and how individuals are members of families, communities, and cultures in general. So all those different groups. Some of the lessons and activities, which would of course be done in the target language, whether that's a world language you're learning or if it's English, if you're an English learner, include things like making sure you provide vocabulary words for feelings appropriate to the student's proficiency level. You've probably done this already as a teacher, but think about when you teach students to express themselves and say that they're happy. Later on, you might add vocabulary like glad or elated. I know in world languages, this is moving different proficiency levels, and we have that in ESL as well, but they also call these multiple tier words because the more advanced you get with your language skills, the greater the variety of words and complexity of language you have to describe. You can also have students reflect on and discuss the different groups that they belong to. Remember, we talked about families, communities, cultures, but it goes beyond that, their state, their country, that kind of thing, and how being a member of these groups really affects how they see the world and how they view the world. For teaching practices, for self-awareness, you can build some background and connect to student experiences. You probably already do that as a teacher, but when you're thinking about teaching them language, and again, you want them to express themselves in the language that they're learning, supporting that background and connections with pictures or role playing is always helpful. Also, a teaching practice that's good for self-awareness is routinely giving students the opportunity to reflect on what they like. We gave the example of what they like to read, or maybe what kinds of events they like to read about. Maybe it's stories, maybe it's poems, maybe it's graphic novels, maybe it's nonfiction. So think about what they like and ask them to reflect on that, either with each other and in pairs, maybe as a journal question, or a longer response if you have more advanced students in the language. So that's self-awareness in our online language classroom. Next up is self-management. Once again, our sort of focused definition for this SEL competency looks at how education is based on the assumption that students will have self-management skills. so that they can calm themselves and focus their attention on learning. It also assumes that they will have goal setting skills, and it's important to teach students to set goals and meet them and talk to them about that process. This will help them academically as well as in life. So for our lessons and activities for self-management, we've got things like teach students to identify what is known about a lesson topic or objective and what they need to know to understand the lesson objective, and then how to set that into a goal to achieve it. Sometimes you use can-do statements like that, or lingua folio-like activities. Sometimes people do SMART goals, or what are called smarter goals, that involve reflection as part of that acronym. But think about how students understand what it is you're teaching them, what you've set out for the day, and how you share that with them to incorporate into their goals. Also, another idea for self-management is to teach a lesson on what the think process to help students sort of responsibly respond in social media or in online learning spaces. If you're teaching a language online, for example, and have discussion forums and things like that. The think acronym is think, T, is it true? H, is it helpful? I, is it inspiring? N, is it necessary? And K, is it kind? Before they post whatever it is they're going to share in that environment. Obviously, if you have another language you're teaching, you might have a target language acronym that's available for this rather than having to use the English one and think, but that's up to you. For teaching practices, for self-management, one of the things is that students can be taught to self-assess their progress toward their learning goals. That's always a good strategy with anyone, because that involves some reflection and helps them really think about their learning and how they're taking the steps they need to meet their goals. If you make this part of your instructional routine, that will help them overall, especially in their academic growth. Another teaching practice is to scaffold a discussion to include all proficiency levels. And you think about that, particularly, I think, with our beginning learners, where you have written words, you let them use pictures, you do checks for understanding, that kind of formative assessment, let them draw responses if they need to, so that they can be part of the discussion with whatever level of proficiency they have in the language. All right, let's move on to responsible decision making. So in the online language classroom, we assume that students have the ability to evaluate options and make effective decisions to complete their assignments or to do the activities that we've set out for them. We also want to have them reflect on values and beliefs of others in the culture they're learning about. And this might include looking at historical figures, characters in literature maybe, or the arts, and members of their local and global community, and think about how are those people exhibiting responsible decision making. So for our lessons and activities, you might have students do something simple like define responsibility and its related terms, ethical, safe, those kinds of terms, and then ask them to write about those words in various ways, maybe relating to their life or to what they're learning or to something that's just happened or something that they've just read. You can also discuss higher order values demonstrated by figures in literature or history or current events. Maybe what's it mean to be a good citizen, or how do you help your community or country? And for those of you who teach classical languages like Latin, tapping into historical figures is very important, because there's a lot of study of those very traditional historical figures in Latin and in the literature that's studied in Latin. So that can still be part of your work with students. And for teaching practices, one of the things that's really recommended with responsible decision making, and is in fact in both the ESL and the World Languages SEL mapping documents, is dialoguing techniques where you encourage students to think through a process for decision making that they can go back to again and again. So asking things like, what's the problem? What are your options? What would be the consequences of those different options? What are you going to try and why? How will you assess how well it worked or not? So thinking about establishing a dialogue technique that they can use repeatedly in solving problems and making a good decision. Moving on to relationship skills in our online language classroom. This focuses on things like developing communication skills, intercultural competence, once again, as most of the others do, but it also looks at collaboration and problem solving and conflict resolution. When we think about activities and projects, we can have project-based learning, virtual exchange projects, which obviously you work with in online language learning, but have become, I think, much easier for everyone to do, given our experience and expertise now in using more online platforms. And you can also do things like cooperative learning techniques. So for relationship skills from our SEL mapping documents, we have things like teach students how to give feedback in specific situations that will help them improve those communication skills. And many of you may already work with students on doing peer feedback with each other. And so it's important that we structure that in a way that they're giving each other constructive feedback that will help, particularly with the communication skills they're building, whether we're looking interpersonal or presentational or interpretive. You can also teach lessons to develop particular communication skills, like listening, let's say, making sure you include nonverbal behavior and things that are culturally appropriate to show that they're listening or that they're engaged with the person that they're talking with or working with. For teaching practices, just providing opportunities for interaction is so important. And of course, we do that in language learning, but think about how you can scaffold that using sentence frames to help your students prepare questions and answers that they might give, particularly when they're new to the language. And also doing things like scripted responses or peer-to-peer conversations so that they can practice and then switch and practice some more. This will help them feel more comfortable, and it will also build their skills in connecting with others. Finally, we want to talk about social awareness. And again, this rests on effective communication in all the different skill areas, writing, speaking, or signing. So if you teach American Sign Language, ASL, or any other sign language around the world, we don't want to forget about signing as a component of effective communication. And this is where you're asking students to think about, where are they in relation to others? How are they similar? How are they different? How can they take a different perspective on what they're reading or hearing or seeing that will help them understand different cultures and experiences, whether they're historical or lived, but also help them think about their own culture in return and their own perspective. So for our lessons and activities examples from the SEL standards mapping documents, you could organize and encourage student projects that really help them dig into things like reading literature or learning about history or global events that are happening, particularly as different cultures react to those events and those happenings, or how they celebrate different things like diversity in an event or literature that they're reading. With teaching practices, of course, you can have meetings, have synchronous meetings, maybe in the morning with your younger students or any scheduled time with older students, but meetings where you can involve your students in sharing and recognizing what others have with their different experiences, what they bring as a strength to the group, and also how students can then develop empathy for others and appreciate those differences and similarities that they're seeing in their classmates. So again, that's social awareness. All right, so that was an overview of our SEL standards mapping documents that we use to help our teachers think about the things that they already do in their classroom that are standards based, that support the development of SEL competencies in their students. So as I said, I wanted you to choose a SEL competency, A, B, C, D, or E there on the right-hand side. Describe how what you just learned about or thought about when we were talking about those different activities and lessons and teaching practices, how you could use that in your own teaching practice. So I want you to write that description in with your SEL competency letter. I'm going to give you a minute or so to finish doing that because I imagine you're already working. And then I'll say the magic word and we will flood the chat. All right, let's go ahead and work a bit. And then we'll finish this off. All right, about 30 more seconds for you to share in your chat response how you're going to implement some lessons or activities or practices that you saw with SEL in your online language classroom. All right, let's go. Let's see them in the chat. What did you decide? I see a lot of great variety. Thank you for sharing tonight or today, depending on what time it is where you're at. All right, I see a lot of good ideas. We have people choosing all of the different SEL competencies. For A, for self-awareness, I see someone saying that they would use the feelings chart to vary responses. The lower proficiency students can point to their responses, and the higher proficiency students can read or remember that. All right. Also for self-awareness, someone said show a photo of a person's face and ask students to create a word cloud to describe the emotion exhibited, and then have them share how this relates to their own lives. Very nice. Compare and contrast cultures. Excellent. Looking for B now for self-management. We have people saying that they would assist students in creating their own goals. They could have students establish what they would like to do before the next class within the parameters of the given assignment, and then find the most important part of the assignment where they need to focus their attention based on the activities in class and the goals that they set. We also have someone saying for self-management, they love to use self-assessment tools like Linguafolio to help students monitor progress and set goals. And that's good to hear because you're going to learn about Linguafolio a bit more when Sally does the second part of our presentation tonight. Another person says for self-management, they'd send out a Google Doc to students as they're preparing for a presentation, ask them to rate how they're keeping on track to be ready for the presentation, so for their preparation. Great. Let's take a look with C, responsible decision making. We have a few people, I think, who choose that. Oh, maybe not so many C's. So D, relationship skills. We have someone who says for relationship skills, they would look at teacher training and helping teachers give constructive feedback to peers and consider how different cultures respond to direct versus indirect comments and criticism. That's so important with language teaching. You know, oftentimes there are very few language teachers in a particular school. So having that opportunity to help your peers and give them feedback is critically important. But we do have to think about the different cultures and what's the best way to give feedback and comments, and particularly criticism. How can we be constructive in a culturally appropriate way with our colleagues? We also have people saying for relationship skills, they would role play and do question and answer exercises. That's very good. And then for E, for social awareness, we've got a few talking about the one-to-one virtual, ask the student to create a dialogue in a different social situation, or maybe use a blank cartoon to fill in. That's kind of a nice idea, because then that puts them in a situation where they're looking at a social situation, but within a cartoon where they can fill in all the conversation. We also have people saying with social awareness, involve community-based or service-based learning, and then engage local senior speakers of the language and find out about their experiences in their home country and in the US. And that's a good time to point out too that many times in our communities, we have a lot of linguistic diversity. So no matter what language you're teaching or your students are learning, there's likely to be someone nearby who is already a speaker or a signer of that language who could be a great resource for your students in your classroom. We also have people saying for E that they would encourage a sense of curiosity towards other cultures and communities by having the students come up with questions that they'd like to research, and then invite guest speakers or do that research so that they could explore more. All right. Well, thank you so much for participating in this activity and thinking about how you would implement SEL competencies into your classroom. We're going to go ahead and wrap up this part of the presentation with the last signature practice, which is an optimistic closure. Obviously, with any time we have learning, even in your own classrooms, you close out that learning experience in an intentional way. It doesn't necessarily have to be optimistic in the sense that it's cheery, but it needs to be an opportunity to think about the work that's been done and to look forward to what comes next and maybe have some reflection. You see here some examples on the screen of optimistic closures. And I'm going to do a combination of those for our optimistic closure of this part of the presentation tonight. and ask you what's true for you. So read through these 5 statements and type your response letters in the chat. So you may decide A is true for you. You had an aha moment about SEL competencies and how you can share that information with colleagues. Or you may decide you want A and B both. Maybe you learned something from this broadcast that you can use with language learners soon. So read through those statements and go ahead and put into the chat box what's true for you, A, B, C, D, E. And you can do that anytime. You don't have to wait to hear go. This is not a waterfall or a flood in the chat. All right, I'm seeing a lot of variety here. Some people said A, B, C, and D. Many people have just one that they're focusing on. See a lot of A's, see a lot of B's, some combinations with B and C. Great. One person chose E, where there was another statement that's true for her. And she said she already does some of these things without knowing it was SEL. Very excited. And that's so true, I think, for us as language educators. We already do quite a bit with SEL. And so it's really just focusing more and saying, this is SEL. I am supporting my students to develop their social and emotional learning skills. All right, well, that's the end of mine. So I'll pause here and look at Q&A and also switch over to Sadly. And I think Sarah has some information for us.
I do. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. This was fantastic. We had a few questions come in. We had a question asking for a few examples of optimistic closure, and we do appreciate taking the time to show us some examples. And that was actually my takeaway. I think I'll try an optimistic closure next time I am with my students in a more live and interactive environment. So looking forward to that. We had another great question come in. What was the rationale behind constructing separate standards for ESL and all other languages? And asking, shouldn't the goals of all language instruction be essentially the same?
Well, Dan, that's a very good question. Obviously, a lot of the states in the US do, in fact, have different standards for not only English language development, like ESL, and world languages, but English language arts as well. We can't forget our colleagues who teach the first language in our particular country, right? And we know that there's a lot of overlap. And in fact, Satley and I commented several times in getting ready for this presentation, how often the things in our SEL standards mapping documents were the same or very, very similar. And that, of course, reflects the fact that our standards often look very similar as well. We're developing proficiency in a language. And so there's not a lot of difference in how you do that when you think about language acquisition. The difference, though, does come in when we think about the context. So the way someone learns a language when it's their second language is a little bit different if that second language is the language of the majority of the population they're in. Like our English learners in the United States, for example, are surrounded by English, whether they're in school or out in the community. But our second language learners who are learning a language that's not the dominant language in our communities, so French or German or Japanese or Spanish or whatever it would be, the language acquisition process becomes a little bit different for them. They don't have as much exposure to the language. And so for world languages, oftentimes we are very focused on making sure we're good models for the language, because that may be the only place students are hearing or seeing, if it's American Sign Language, or working with the language, right, is in our classrooms. ESL has things a little bit different. But of course, then their focus in their learning context is learning academic language so that their English learners can be successful in classes beyond just languages. They have to be successful in science and social studies and math and so on and so forth. And then again, English language arts is even different because the way you're learning language there is structured a little bit different for English language arts or ELA. So that's a great question though, and there is a lot of overlap for sure.